Welcome to Foregenix Fireside Chats. Today we'll be exploring everything you need to know about implementing PTS version 7 devices into your payment solution. With the new requirements introduced by PTS version 7, is your business ready to maintain operational security and to achieve alignment with PCI expectations? I'm your host, Tal Minks, and joining us today are two subject matter experts, Paolo Basilio, Managing Principal and Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Foregenix, and Brian Bell, Managing Principal and Vice President of Global Sales. Together, they bring decades of experience in cybersecurity, cryptography, and digital forensics. It's great to have both of you here.
Thanks, Tal. It's great to be here and really looking forward to chatting about today's topic.
Thanks, Al. Appreciate the introduction.
Well, let's jump right in. To begin with, can you both summarize the main changes being introduced in PCI PTS version 7 and which requirements payment service providers should be paying attention to?
Sure, Tal. First of all, there's about 4 different areas where changes are being introduced into PTS version 7. So the one area is around the cryptography used for device security needs to be at least 128 bits of strength. And of course, this rules out triple DES because even triple length, triple DES keys do not provide you with 128 bits of strength. So for these device security features, and these are things like firmware validation and other internal POI device security mechanisms, these need to use a bit strength of at least 128 bits. Of course, this doesn't apply to things like card data encryption or PIN encryption that can continue to use triple DES in accordance with other standards like PCI PIN and P2PE. So these changes are more related to the manufacturer. The other area which I think is quite interesting, and Brian, I think you might think this is also quite an interesting area going forward, but this is the introduction of requirements that are related to biometric readers. So the security of the biometric readers, the integrity of the readers, and the keys that are used to secure biometric data, these are now all incorporated into the device evaluation. And in terms of the PTS listing, they will be a function provided, would be biometric reader. And of course, this shows where the industry is going around CVM and how cardholders will verify going forward. Do you want to weigh in on that area, Brian, on the biometric reader side?
Yeah, I think to your point about TLS, I don't think anybody's surprised or shocked that triple DES is being deprecated. You got to have at least 128 bits of encryption. Same thing on biometrics. I don't think biometrics is anything new. We've seen a lot of POS vendors that are developing solutions at the checkout for paying with biometrics already. So there are a lot of concerns around it, though, related to consumer privacy. Who's going to validate the biometric information, where that information is going to be stored, and how it's going to be used and shared with potentially other third parties.
Yeah, I think the impact would be huge in the payments industry specifically, because I think in terms of biometrics, how the data is validated by issuers is going to be the interesting part of that implementation. But as I said, those areas are more sort of focused on the manufacturing side and might have some strategic relevance. But I think the two areas that apply to service providers around TLS protocol requirements that have been introduced now, and of course, the third-party application concept that have been introduced. And I think this is going to have more of an impact on the service provider side and the solution providers that are using the devices in their estate.
Well, you just touched on it, but could we unpack how TLS and third-party application requirements will impact payment service providers and what they should be doing to prepare for these?
The TLS enhancements, the encryption strength enhancements, those are not super surprising to a lot of people. It could have an impact. You're going to have to evaluate your applications, both non-payment and payment applications, to make sure that they're ready to support new encryption standards. But this is not super surprising. To me, I think the big change that will have a dramatic impact is going to be this idea of application segmentation and sandboxing within version 7 devices, especially when you start looking at Android-related devices where, that you've got an open architecture where people can write. It's more easy for people to write their own applications, loyalty applications, who knows, doing a lot of different things, and integrating those into the PTS version 7 device while it's co-resident with payment applications introduces a lot of security concerns. We've reached out to a number of our partners and device vendors and talked through the implications of the sandboxing for PTS version 7 devices. And there's a lot of questions around how legitimately data could be shared between the two applications in a secure manner. Suppose you have a non-payment software that has loyalty information that needs to apply a discount at checkout. How does that information get passed back to the payment application? There's some concerns there. Another big one is around the IP stack. Are non-payment software applications allowed to use the standard Java library for their IP stack, or are they required to use the OP module? And in either case, you introduce potential security concerns, whether or not you have a non-validated application reaching into the secure module to use the OP module for IP communications, or do you allow non-payment software to use the IP stack from Java and potentially open up vulnerabilities for inbound attacks?
I think it's interesting, yeah, Brian. The main impacts are going to be around those vendors that are developing these applications for these devices. So how are they able to get the data they need to function those third-party applications? How do they get the loyalty data if this is read through the card reader or the contactless reader or whatever? I think these are important things to understand and evaluate and talk to your PTS vendor about, because these changes are potentially going to have an impact on the applications that you're currently running on your traditional PEG deployments. I think the other interesting area, Brian, is on the OP side, or as you mentioned, on the TLS implementation, because PTS version 7 is requiring the support of TLS 1.3, and of course disallowing earlier versions of TLS earlier than 1.2, but also disallowing anything with a bit strength lower than 128 bits. And though it might not be new news in the industry, but of course, there are still vendors that are using weaker cipher suites that need to understand this, because those are going to be explicitly disallowed going forward. And they'll probably need to make changes to their applications, or at least the code, which is calling the network stack of the device, to make sure that they implement these stronger cipher suites.
Well, thank you. I'd like to go a little more in depth on that, Paolo, on the topic of TLS protocols. In environments with a mix of POI devices that are both PTS 7 and lower versions, how should TLS configurations be handled? Is it acceptable to maintain TLS 1.2 for legacy devices?
Yeah, indeed. Well, of course, TLS 1.2 is still acceptable, and in the context of PCI DSS and other standards which basically speak to these requirements, these are acceptable. But obviously, these new requirements will be enforced on PTS version 7 devices by the PTS terminal vendors. So the manufacturers will only support these versions. And so you'll need to at least implement those changes for environments where you are supporting the deployment of the PTS version 7 devices.
Thank you for going into more depth on that, Paolo. We mentioned third-party applications a few times. How do these changes impact how these applications are designed and implemented on POI devices?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the challenges, especially with PTS version 7 devices, where you've got this sandboxed environment for non-payment applications. The challenge is going to be business cases and different deployment models where you need to share non-payment data between the non-payment application and the payment application. And so you're kind of crossing the stream, so to speak, between, this sandboxed environment and the secured environment. Now, the way that's done today in a lot of cases, there are memory shares that the devices typically support. You can use loopback addresses for the IP stack. However, with PTS version 7, with the sandboxing of those applications, that may not be possible. I would think you would still be able to support the IP stack using maybe a loopback address or something like that. But definitely, these are things that application vendors are going to need to investigate. And the impact to changing the applications could be significant.
Yeah, agreed, Brian. And I think, you've got some experience on the app development side and sort of understand the changes, particularly on Android environments. as I understand, Android applications generally operate in sort of a sandbox user space almost already. But I guess these PTS requirements are going to take that further and restrict further how data moves across from application to application, and especially from the firmware and operating system to the application layer. And the explicit requirement in the standard is that sensitive data, be that cardholder data or whatever, never goes from the operating system or payment applications to these third-party apps. And of course, this is the channel generally that loyalty cards are read through and that type of stuff. So it'll be interesting to understand how the implementation will affect applications in that sort of third-party app sandboxed environment going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, one of the things that you have to consider is, potentially today you've got a little more flexibility because you're managing the segmentation and the isolation between apps at the software layer. This is pushed down to the firmware and the hardware layer. You won't have any control over what the implementation model looks like. So the impact to how communications are established and how the interaction occurs between payment and non-payment software could change significantly and have a dramatic impact to the design of the application.
Thank you both for weighing in on that. Now that we've gone over the different changes, different requirements, what steps can service providers take to prepare for a smooth transition to PCI PTS 7 certified POIs?
So I think the first thing, Tal, is to socialize the changes with the software development teams that are developing applications. Of course, the TLS specific requirements are going to be important for the development teams, as well as understanding what architectural changes will be introduced and will impact the current third-party applications that are running on these devices. And I think engagement with the POI device manufacturers is key in this process to understand the implications, what they've implemented, what new features are there, and how this is going to impact the current applications that are running on these devices.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Like I said earlier, we've already been talking to a lot of our partners and customers related to payment applications on PTS devices. We've been working with a number of our device manufacturers and the relationships we have with them. And devices operate, differently from one manufacturer to the other, and the implications that this application segmentation at the hardware layer is going to have on the applications could be significant. So it's important to engage these vendors, work with us directly at Foregenix, and we can help facilitate those conversations and get in front of it quickly because, again, the changes to the application could be significant, and it may take a number of months to re-architect some of these applications to operate in this new environment.
I think we've gone over a lot and covered a lot of helpful information regarding these topics. So let's wrap up with a closing insight. What's one key action or message you want today's attendees to take away?
Well, from my side, I think, Tal, it's important to engage with the POI device manufacturers and understand the implications or the impact of these changes on applications that are deployed into the environment. So engage. And then in terms of the engagement process, that'll inform you to put action plans in place to make changes or update applications according to those changes.
Yeah, one thing I would add is, to me, it's fairly comical sometimes thinking about the fact that a lot of the encryption used to protect card data was developed in the late 70s. We're closing in on 50 years that this encryption solution's been in place. And, my message is simply get in front of it now, because the changes that are coming related to enhanced cryptography, sandboxing at the hardware level between secured software and non-secured software is going to be dramatic. And it's important to get in front of it now to understand what the impact is going to be to your payment environments.
Thank you both for your final words of wisdom. And I want to thank you both for being here also on Foregenix Fireside Chats.
Thank you, Tal. It was great to be here.
Thanks, Tal. Appreciate it. Really enjoyed the conversation.
We've seen that PCI PTS 7 brings new challenges, but also new opportunities to elevate the security and resilience of the payment ecosystem. We encourage all service providers to begin planning now, well before compliance deadlines are enforced. If you enjoyed this fireside chat, please be sure to check out the other videos on our channel or visit our website for further articles and videos on related topics. Thank you again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time on our Foregenix Fireside Chats.